Alright, welcome to part number 2 of the build order breakdown from Liquid Nony's Protoss versus Terran. I'm going to fast forward through as we've already seen this game. I'm just going to be talking about the decision making and also going back to referencing the build and why Nony does what he does do. Of course, going to be chrono boosting those probes, throwing down the gateway on 13 and getting that gas geyser soon afterward. Nony in this build non-stop produces probes out of his nexus, even if he's at full saturation in his main base. This will allow you to transfer a good number of probes down to your expansion as soon as it finishes, allowing you to keep up with the Terran economically. Sentry going to be produced out of that gateway, and second gas finishing up. Nony just chasing around this SCV, going to be not getting it. And the Robo bay coming down. Second gateway and pylon going down as well. A little bit of a whip of a force field, but no big deal, only losing 2 probes to that Reaper. So, as these 2 gateways finish up, Nony's going to be doing a small push out with some stalkers. Okay, so here, this push is okay, because none of the forces of the Terran opponent are going to have stim. So, if we look at the movement speed of all the units, let us look at that. 2.25, we have 2.25. All of these units move relatively the same pace, except for the stalkers, which actually move faster. If we look at a Marine and a Marauder, they also have a movement speed of 2.25. So, should Nony get to the bottom of the ramp and find himself up against a bunker or up against a concave of units, he can easily retreat. The only thing he would have to be worried about is the Marauder concussive shell. I'm not actually sure if that is finished. No, it's not. But, of course, the Immortal will be able to tank a lot of damage from that concussive shell, and the Terran most likely not going to be following Nony down the ramp, as Nony will be able to force field. And that's the other important thing. Force fields going to be a key part of defense, especially if your Terran opponent is going to be aggressive early game. So Nony just pushes up here, sees no expansion. Obviously there is one behind it, but going to be retreating. You don't want to keep your units down there. As I said before, these units are very key to your defense. You only have 2 gateways and you don't want to have to throw down more. That costs a lot of money. And it also encourages you to warp in from all 4 at the same time. And going for that second observer just because his first one got picked off. Fast Robo bay. This is very standard, 2 gateways and a Robo. Sometimes you'll see Protoss players throw down that 3rd gateway, but Nony opting to go for only 2. And as I said before, as the expansion is finishing up, Nony transfers a bunch of his probes down, and he still has good saturation in his main base. A little bit early on that probe transfer, he is going to, however, turn those around. Okay, so now Nony gonna be producing those colossus and not going for that range upgrade. Let's pause for just a second to talk about this. Now, range is a very, very vital upgrade for those colossus. It will allow your colossus to stay slightly farther behind your army than they normally do, which will make them harder targets to pick off for stimmed units or just any units in general. So, the range upgrade will allow your colossus to be safer. However, Nony deals with this with his zealots. If the Terran moves forward into the army, trying to pick off the colossus, he will be met by a bunch of zealots. So, by warping in more zealot sentry than stalkers, Nony is actually providing himself more safety for his colossus, and also providing himself more gas to tech faster by not going for that thermal lance upgrade. Just a bit of information there. Gonna be fast forwarding it again. Second Immortal just popping out. You don't need to worry too much about this number. And of course, gonna be throwing down that Forge and Twilight Council behind this. And 2 gas as well. Now here, Nony has an observer spotting this army. A general thing that Terran or any race will do is to time your pushes so that your upgrades finish when you reach the bottom of your opponent's base, or near your opponent's base. So for instance, this Terran is going to have his medevacs, he's going to have stim, when his army reaches the bottom of Nony's ramp. However, because the army is not at the bottom of Nony's ramp, these upgrades aren't done. We have one medevac here with the army, and the second one still being produced. So Nony gonna be moving forward and picking off a few free units because he knows most likely this army does not have stim. He also sees not a whole lot of medevacs with the army, as there's only one, so it would actually be detrimental to the Terran opponent to stim. If the Terran opponent did stim, Nony could just easily force field, walk away, and force those medevacs to use up most of their energy. However, Nony ends up getting a few free units, of course with that observer able to spot the movements of his Terran buddy. Force fielding that Colossus does end up scaring the Terran opponent into retreating. This is another thing. It's actually very hard to tell if a Colossus has range or not in the middle of an engagement, unless they have a lot of Colossus and you can tell, oh, there's just a bunch of Colossus in the back of his army. But if your army is just walking around and you suddenly engage, it's very difficult to tell whether or not a Colossus has range. And of course, Nony also wants to reveal his Colossus. This is a mind game that you can play with Terran. Terran has two choices to counter the two AoE, area of effect, damage units that the Protoss has. The first one is the counter to Colossus, which is of course Vikings. We do see one popping out right now, and a second one is going to be, or actually three more are going to be popping out in just a second. So, the other counter to the AoE unit is the Ghost, which counters the Templar, as the EMP does remove all those energies that the Protoss has. So by revealing this Colossus, even though he doesn't have range, he is forcing his Terran opponent to decide, do I want more medevacs out of my starport, or do I want more Vikings? Vikings being the choice for this Terran opponent, still going to be reducing the health, overall health of this bio ball. Of course, stimming causes the medevacs to use their energy, and with less medevacs means less stims, less damage able to be sustained by the bio. So, Nony going to be forcing his opponent to decide whether or not to produce Vikings or medevacs, and some Terran opponents will actually throw down a second starport and produce 3 or 4 of those at a time. So, Nony, obviously already switching into Storm, going to be throwing down his additional gateways, and this, again, the Storm, is able to be researched because he did not go for that early Thermal Lance upgrade. Had he gone for that early Thermal Lance, he would have just been able to afford Storm. And even though it's only 40 seconds, it's still quite a big difference. And Nony sees some Vikings, of course, knowing that Vikings are going to be produced in counter to the Colossus. And if we fast forward in this engagement, we will see the Viking count. So more Vikings going to be arriving. Terran opponent does engage, and Nony sees 5 Vikings. 5 Vikings is not a whole lot. You generally want 8 or 9 to counter those Colossus, as they do 1 or 2 shot them. Even though Nony loses all of his Colossus, he gains vital information about the Viking count. And of course, more Vikings being rallied in here, and only 2. No medevacs being with these, not 4, so Nony knows there's only 1 starport. He also knows that the Terran is not overcommitting to Viking production. Pause again. If the Terran had thrown down a second starport and started pumping out 3 or 4 Vikings at a time to counter those Colossus, Nony could have easily switched into Zealot Archon, as he already has the infrastructure. He could have completely stopped producing Colossus, thrown down 3 more gateways, and non-stop produced Zealots and Templar. However, because Nony only sees 2 reinforcing Vikings and a relatively low Viking count, he is able to say, even though I lost all of my colossus, if I continue producing them, you're going to either have to continue using your Vikings, or your starport to produce Vikings, instead of medevacs, or you're going to have to produce medevacs and not be able to counter my colossus. So, Nony reproduces those colossus, and upon seeing the non-overcommitment from his Terran opponent, he gets that thermal lance upgrade. And armor level 2 coming out. If we look at the Zealot, Zealots have more health than shields. So the armor upgrade is going to benefit Chargelots a whole lot. Of course, these other units have about relatively even shield count. This Immortal obviously having the hardened shield, so it's not really important to look at there. Templar, just a general weak unit. However, the Zealots are going to be the main meat of your army, especially if you're going for Zealot Archon. As well, because you're doing such fast tech with this build, you're going to not have a whole lot of gas, which means you're going to have a whole lot of money to warp in Zealots. And again, this is why you don't want to warp in a whole lot of Stalkers, because even though Stalkers are useful for shooting down those air units, for defending against drops, the Stalkers eat up a whole lot of gas, and you want your gas to be invested in your infrastructure or into your Colossus production. So, with all of that said and done, Nony, of course, warping in Stalkers as he is going to be pushing out against his Terran opponent. One more, and scan goes down. Nony gonna move out in a second. Come on, Nony, do it. Warping in more Stalkers as he is going to be pushing out in just a second. Come on, Nony, don't make me look bad. There we go. Okay. So, here we have a push out. Not a whole lot of Colossus, not a whole lot of Templar, but this is still a very scary army. Anyway, without further ado, let us move into part number 3, where we're going to be looking at a second game by Liquid Nony, in which he does the same build. It doesn't actually get as far. However, under different circumstances, Nony decides to do a more committed early game push, and actually ends up forcing a GG out of his Terran opponent. Just gonna watch this army get destroyed. And, of course, Terran opponent gonna be leaving soon afterward. So, let's move in to part number 2.